Thomas Golubic is the music supervisor for Space Force, the new Netflix comedy series. I'm at Noble Hero Gold Derby. Here to ask you, Thomas, what was the most challenging thing in Space Force to supervise the music for?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
The hardest part in many ways was figuring out the tone. The show it's a comedy. It's a comedy that takes place in the current time, in fact, in the current administration. And the basic premise is that Steve Carell is playing a sort of a career general who has been promoted to become the head of the new Space Force, which is essentially the next arm of the military. And, it is unusual times, to say the least, under the Trump administration. So in many ways, we're gently poking fun at the chaos of the current administration. And what happens when sort of a decent guy who is, a career military person is responsible for trying to do the impossible, and have completely unreasonable expectations and find a way to make it work. So trying to find the right tone was really the most difficult part. We knew that we wanted it to be funny, obviously. It's a comedy. We also wanted to be very sincere about the main character, Steve Carell's, character. We wanted to make sure that we were always being respectful of his point of view and his perspective. And so in many ways, it was the balancing of having a sincere score, which was really representing the way he felt about the world and his sort of natural patriotism, but also helping to, fill in the space of the craziness of what happens in the show.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I guess, was there a particular episode or moment where you felt that worked particularly well?
Well, I think the pilot in many ways is sort of the first episode is in many ways the best starting point. It's a lot goes on. It's basically a very difficult day. We get introduced to General Naird, and he's essentially trying to convince several Congress people that they should continue to fund the Space Force, that, he's dependent upon their funding to continue. And he's having lots of problems getting rockets to go off properly. And there's a lot of risk that one will not happen. His head of science, played by John Malkovich, is basically trying to move him away from sending it that day, thinking only about the science of it. Meanwhile, Naird has to think about the politics of it. And in order to kind of capture the tone of it, it was a mixture of using music as a valve for General Naird. One of the premises to the show is that when he reaches the apex of tension, he basically sings songs to himself. And in doing so, he basically has a valve, a release of sorts. And we had to try to figure out what that song was going to be. We chose largely songs that were not acapella, they were falsetto, very high vocals. And that way, Steve would be straining to reach those songs. We had Bee Gees songs in the mix. We ended up putting into the first episode a Beach Boys song called Kokomo, which was sort of a sequence where he sings to sort of calm himself down. So we had to kind of build that premise, and we had to, with Carter, really establish the tone of the show as a whole. I've lost you, by the way. I don't know if you are.
You just lost my video. Just turn that off so don't take up half the screen. But I'm still here in voice and spirit.
All right, fair enough. Yeah. So I'd say the first episode was probably the most challenging.
Yeah, I did think watching that first episode, or seeing that trait of Steve Carell to sing pop songs, that was a particularly potentially expensive character trait for the character, but it worked quite well.
Yes, it was. That was one of the. We had a lot of financial challenges in the show. Number one, there was an enormous amount of CGI in the show, so we knew that there was going to be a lot of computer-generated imagery. That was going to be very costly to develop. So a lot of times we were working with very little to look at. There's a whole sequence in episode 2 where we have a chimp in space, and we had nothing but drawings for a very long time that we were working with. And Carter in particular was doing an amazing job building the score with very little to work off of. So I think it's a great example of his flexibility and his ability to work under pressure. Likewise, the songs were all pricey. They were iconic songs. They needed to be expensive, iconic songs. So we kind of had to figure out how to make them all affordable. So we ended up using maybe less than we would have otherwise, simply because of the cost of it. But we used them as effectively as we could in those moments.
Yeah, no, they were spread out quite a bit throughout the season as well, so it wasn't all in episode 1 and 2, and then not for the rest of the season. You spoke about Carter doing the composing for the show. You're the music supervisor. Some people like myself might not know how those two roles sort of work together on a series. Do you want to explain that a little bit?
Sure. So the music supervisor is usually brought in very early. It's the responsibility of the music supervisor to discuss with the creators of the show how music will work in the show, what the options are. So in some situations, we'll be brought in when there's just a script. That was the case here. I just read a script and basically came to the table with a lot of different ideas. And so some of those ideas were bringing in, for instance, certain composers that we felt would work really well as a model. Aaron Copland is a sort of a early 20th century composer who created very sort of patriotic themes and really captured sort of the spirit of the American spirit, I guess. And that was sort of like a starting point. So we utilized that. We also looked into Jerry Goldsmith, who had done some scores that were rather patriotic. Elmer Bernstein, and we talked a lot about his score to Patton and his score to The Great Escape. Yes, The Great Escape. And then also how he did a sort of a serious score to a comedy in Stripes, the Bill Murray film. And so how sometimes when you score things in a very serious, direct way, you're able to actually help the comedy as well. So playing it straight can frequently be a very successful approach. So that led to which composers did we feel would be appropriate for it? And then the job for me was to reach out to different composers and start requesting demos and bringing different people to the table. And we ended up landing on Carter, who did an absolutely magnificent job. Another part of the complexity of the job of the supervisor is figuring out how will the score be done? Will the score be done as an electronic score? Will it be done as an orchestral score? Where will it be recorded? How will that get handled? So part of the job with Carter was Carter had not recorded in Nashville before. And because he's based in upstate New York, production is based in Southern California, we felt that even though London was a place that he'd done a lot of score work before, it would be, because of our time schedule being so tight and our budget being so tight, it would make more sense to record in Nashville. So we worked together with Mike Macaron, the post-production producer, and a lot of Greg Daniels' team to figure out a smart way that Carter would be able to deliver the score with a really tight time frame. So we decided that we would do 2 orchestral sessions, one on the front end, one on the back end. So the first half of the season would be recorded, and then we would utilize and repurpose some of that score as temp in the second half of the season. And then we'd have a second orchestral session, which would do the final bits of the episodes. And that final recording session was March 15th, right as COVID-19 was shutting everything down. In fact, I believe the recording that Carter did in Nashville was the very last one before they closed the entire facility and were done because of the pandemic. So it was done right to the very last minute. And then additionally, when it comes to the songs, I assembled different ideas with my team of songs that we could possibly use in different sequences. Everything from songs that Steve might sing, to background uses, to music for different characters. One of the characters is a Russian, so we had a lot of fun finding Euro techno that would be kind of in the world of this sort of young Russian spy. So it was kind of like finding different fun choices for different characters, figuring out what we'd be playing at the Space Force gym. Really anything that's involving music in a project, the supervisor is involved in helping to navigate that along. Someone who's a skilled professional like Carter, he didn't need that much, assistance from us outside of bringing him to the table. But we worked with Greg to kind of help to navigate his score notes so he could hopefully articulate good ideas and help to find ways of getting Carter to deliver the different things that they needed. So it was very collaborative. Greg's a very collaborative filmmaker. So there were a lot of voices in the room, which can make things more complicated and harder at times. But I think that, the results really hopefully speak for themselves.
Yeah. It seems like a job of choices. What's the choice you're most proud of making for Space Force?
It's like a thousand cuts. There's no individual choice ultimately. It's your job is really, you're almost like you're like an interior decorator for a house, right? You're brought into this beautiful house that is completely blank. There's nothing on the walls. There's no fixtures. And it's your job to go in there and say, here's a few different options, and here's some color choices, and here's some approaches, and here's what we can afford. Here's what is too expensive, or if this is a really high priority for you, we can really put a lot of money at this, but then we're going to have to skimp elsewhere. Your job is really to help tell a story and tell that story within the budget that you have, within the time frame that you have, and within the personalities that are ultimately making those creative choices with you. So it's really an issue of having lots of different options and then ushering each element of it to the finish line. That's including clearing the songs. That's including making sure the audio is delivered to the music editors correctly, making sure that everything is cut the right way, that as you're presenting options, that they're all edited in a way that feels seamless and is not problematic. That can be very difficult when you have a very famous song, because the audience knows the song really well, and you don't want to have someone trip and why is that song suddenly changing? I'm so familiar with it. So it's tricky to bring all those things together and make it seamless. So the trick really is, how do you do it where it really feels seamless and clean?
A lot of your career, you've done drama series and worked on them for this. And as you've said before, and you've talked a bit about already with us, it being a comedy. Was comedy something you were looking to do as something a bit different, or was it just fall in your lap and it was a bit daunting having to take on a comedy?
No, I mean, I also work on Grace and Frankie, which is a comedy. So
yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and that we've been doing that for a number of years. I've done a number of comedies over the years. I mean, they're very different. I think that, the most high-profile projects that I've done have been largely dramas. I think 6 Feet Under was sort of, a drama in essence, sort of like an elaborate soap opera of sorts, but it was a contemporary one. So the job there really was being able to flavor the world of the Fisher family with the music that was appropriate to each of their generations and their personalities in contemporary Los Angeles in the early 2000s. Breaking Bad is very much, a story of it's a very fast-paced story taking place in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and it's a very different world. So it was really creating the world there and working with Dave Porter, the composer, to, have a score that really spoke to that environment, but also using music in comedic terms. Because I think that for Breaking Bad, a lot of times music, and that's the case also for Better Call Saul, we use music in both shows as sort of a comedic thing as well. So I think in many ways, comedy has always existed inside the dramas that I've worked with. And in this case, it's drama very much working within the context of a comedy.
Yeah, and in some ways, as you say, how being the straight man can play the comedy more. In Space Force, you see like how dramatic music can help sort of highlight the ridiculousness of what's going on, whereas in maybe Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, music was used more to hit those comedic beats sometimes.
Agreed. And I think it's, there's always a balance between the two. I mean, my favorite work is always kind of landing a little bit between those two worlds, between comedy and drama. To me, like the shows that I love the most nowadays are shows like Rami or High Maintenance, shows that basically are ostensibly comedies, but they have a lot of dramatic components and they operate as dramas. So I think that's sort of a world that I'm really comfortable in.
Do you have, in Space Force, do you have a moment that you just think is the funniest moment or something that makes you laugh every time you see it?
Oh, my God. I can tell you one that I laughed out loud when I read the script. I mean, to the point that I think I knocked something over. There's a sequence where you've got General Naird and John Malkovich's character, Dr. Mallory, and they're basically talking about that they've been working together for a little bit. And they're talking about it was a flashback basically to where General Naird complained about having a button cover, like $1,000 button cover over the missile thing. And then they show this great scene where the two of them are sitting there and he pops his feet up and accidentally presses the button and the missile goes off. It's like one of those like great slapstick things, but it was so underplayed and so unbelievably funny that I just laughed out loud. And as soon as I I read that sequence in the pilot. I already loved the pilot, but that just made me in love with the show. And I thought, well, if we're able to have these really wonderful, quick jokes in there that are just fall over funny, this is going to be a show I'm going to love doing. Also, like the scene with, I'm blanking his character's name, the sort of army liaison, everything coming out of those, out of those actors is just brilliant. The nice thing of the show is Greg loves working with really wonderful actors. And so you get a chance to have like Fred Willard, like the sequence. I have to say, the Fred Willard scene, may he rest in peace, is to me one of the funniest things I've seen in any show in the longest time. Fred Willard plays his dad, and the whole sequence about him talking about climbing underneath the house, every child's fear of their, slightly deranged parent, climbing under the house to disappear. It's unbelievably funny. And, that he has his mom is perpetually disappearing. It was so sad when Fred passed away, because he was one of the absolute highlights of the first season, and it would have been such a joy to continue having his work. I mean, there's so much to love, but I got to say, Fred Willard to me was the funniest of the first season, and it was just extraordinary, and he will be really sorely missed.
Yeah. Yeah, and to wrap up today, Thomas, just to ask you, was there a movie or a TV show for you growing up that sort of inspired your love for, or made you realize the difference music can make in storytelling?
Oh, absolutely. When I was 10 years old, my dad brought me to the 10th anniversary of 2001: A Space Odyssey, the Stanley Kubrick film. And, I don't know why my dad thought a 10-year-old would enjoy it, but I think my dad would take me to movies that he would enjoy. So, like, I saw a lot of Ingmar Bergman films when I was a kid. I really understood that kids watch different things. So we watched 2001: A Space Odyssey in these, at Boston University, which is where he was a professor, in these rickety little chairs that were incredibly uncomfortable. And even though it's a very long and slow movie, I was absolutely mesmerized by it. And I liked it so much that I got my dad to bring me back to see it again, I think like a couple days later, so I wouldn't stop talking about it. So for whatever reason, I think seeing that film and experiencing sort of poetry with music and film was so powerful to me that I never stopped being in love with it. I mean, to me, 2001: A Space Odyssey is the greatest example of how music can transport an audience into a story that is incredibly abstract and is really allowing the audience to throw themselves into it and figure out how they feel about it and what it's about even. That permission for allowing the audience engagement to create something unique to themselves and to have their own very unique experience with the film was really great. I think music was a key part of that. That was certainly the starting point for me.
Oh, fantastic. So from Space Odyssey to Space Force, thank you so much, Thomas, for talking with us today. And all the best with the upcoming Emmy Awards and other things down the pipeline. And for people watching this interview, you can go to goldderby.com to make your own awards predictions and watch other interviews with awards contenders. Thank you so much, Thomas. That was a great chat.
It was a pleasure. Cheers.